Several years ago, I heard my pastor growing up tell the funniest story about a guy who was getting ready to go on the business trip of a lifetime. He was going to Rome and he was super excited about it. So he wanted to get his hair cut and he went to his barber who happened to be Italian. But that barber also happened to be a pretty critical guy. So he told his barber, he says, "Man, I got to look good because I'm getting ready to go on to Rome on the business trip of a lifetime." And the barber said, "Oh man, you're going to be so disappointed because it's so overrated. The hotel service, horrible. Food's not that great. The airlines always lose your luggage. And let's face it, those people over there are pretty cheap. And most of the time, they're not buying. I think you're going to be pretty disappointed. You may as well just stay home." Well, the guy left after he got his hair cut, and a few weeks later, he came back in, and the barber said, "Well, how did your trip to Rome go?" He said, "Man, it was awesome. I mean, awesome." He said, "I went, and the food was great. The hotel service was great. And you know something? The airlines didn't lose any bag. I made the big deal that I was hoping to make. And you know something? I was even able to see the Pope." "What, you were able to see the Pope?" "Yes, I was like so excited. I got to see the Pope." "Well, what did the Pope say to you?" "Well, he said, I went in there to his chambers and I knelt down before his chair and he was sitting right there and it was just such a remarkable moment. And the next thing I know, the Pope reached out and he put his hand on my head and he said, my son, who gave you such a lousy haircut?" That was a hilarious story because it reminded me of a couple of things. It reminded me, first of all, everybody's a critic, and secondly, all of us are recipients of criticism from time to time. And we happen to live in a culture where we train people, we pay people to be critics. People are critics of restaurants, people are critics of movies, one thumb up, one thumb down, two thumbs up. I mean, listen, we pay people to criticize. Well, I understand that criticism is a part of our culture, and I also realize that criticism is not always easy to take. And to be honest with you, sometimes I have to acknowledge that criticism can sometimes be helpful, and sometimes, we ought to be thankful for it. But at other times, it's not something that's helpful. At other times, it's designed to be hurtful. Here's the problem with criticism that you and I have to deal with. The problem is that sometimes criticism that you and I receive can become a huge distraction in our lives. We get so fixated on the criticism that it knocks us off task, that it knocks us off a mission, that it really keeps us from fulfilling the purpose that God has laid out for us in our lives. Now, one thing that seems to be missing in our culture today is this idea of civility. It's like civility is almost like on life support in our current culture today. We look around and we think, where are the statesmen? I mean, we're just dying for statesmen today. We are in desperate need of statesmen. And you know something? Hopefully, we want to be that kind of person who is a statesman. That kind of leader who is a statesman. But in order for that to happen, I think we have to handle criticism well. So I'd like to share with you a few things quickly about ways that I think that we can handle criticism better. Number one, accept criticism as normal. I mean, we just have to understand criticism is a part of our life. It always has been, really. I mean, historically, we have seen people who are even very significant leaders and influential leaders who have been people who have received a lot of criticism. I think about men like Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul. Certainly, he received more than his fair share of criticism. I think we can make the case that even Jesus received his fair share of criticism. Listen, and the thing about criticism that's so hard is that sometimes it's hard to accept for a couple reasons. One reason is because sometimes the area that we're criticized in is something we're vulnerable in, And so if someone's telling us something about ourselves that we know that we might be vulnerable in, it's harder for us to accept. I get that. But also, I think criticism is hard for us to accept whenever it comes from someone that we're close to, someone that we feel like is a friend of ours. It's one thing when someone who doesn't know me just wants to criticize me, but it's a whole nother ballgame when it's somebody that I love, someone that I respect, someone I consider to be a friend, sometimes that makes it hard to receive. So understand though, criticism is a normal part of everyday life, and we just have to understand that. Number two, we need to be careful how we respond. I bring this up because I struggle with this sometimes. One of my gifts, I think, is the gift of sarcasm. Okay, I'm joking about that, but it is a gift, I think. But sometimes I'm tempted to rely on sarcasm, especially whenever I do receive criticism. Sometimes I want to respond in a way that, frankly, is designed more to hurt than designed to help. And we do this, I think, because we feel like we need to prove to ourselves that we're right about something, or maybe even prove to ourselves our self-worth, because we feel like the criticism that came our way was an attack on our self-worth. And so we want to respond in a way that shows that we really are worthy of love, worthy of respect. And so we will respond sometimes in a way that's more hurtful than helpful. I read about years ago about a running feud between Winston Churchill and Lady Astor. And he had the funniest lines as she would come up and criticize him. One day she came up to him and she said, "Winston, I think you're drunk." And he looked back at her and he says, "Well, I believe you're ugly, but at least I'll be sober in the morning." Great line. And I mean, it makes me chuckle, to be honest with you. She came up to him one day. She said, "Winston, if you were my husband, I would put poison in your wine." He said, "If you were my wife, I would drink it." So, they had a running feud, and he responded a lot with sarcasm, designed to hurt, not help. I'm just saying we need to be careful how we respond. Number three, we need to realize we need to respond only when it's necessary. A great example of this is a guy in the Old Testament by the name of Nehemiah, who was rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem, and he was doing some great work. But he had his critics. Two guys in particular. One, his name was Sanballat. The other guy's name was Tobiah. And they would come by from time to time and they would criticize his work on the wall. One day they came by and they said, "Nehemiah, we want you to come down. We need to talk to you about a few things." He knew what they were going to do. They were just going to level their criticisms at him. And so he looked back at him and he said, "Listen, I can't come down right now because I'm doing a great work. Hey, listen, I get it. Sometimes criticism needs our response, but oftentimes it doesn't need a response from us. It just needs to run off our backs. And that's hard for me. In my world, I typically am going to receive criticism. I mean, it happens on a regular basis. I would dare say probably a weekly basis. And maybe in your life, you feel the same way, whether it's at home or with your job or wherever. People respond in different ways, or they share their criticism in different ways. One way that happens often is just through email. I guess it's because it's such an easy way to communicate, and they don't have to sit down with you face to face. So I'll get emails from time to time that are designed to be critical, and sometimes they're not designed to be particularly helpful. And what I will want to do is I will sometimes want to respond with this glorious response that's dripping with sarcasm. And sometimes I actually, will write out a response that is glorious in my mind and dripping with sarcasm. The only thing I don't do is I don't push the send button. It's something I've done for therapy. I've written it and it's therapeutic, all right? Now, I get it. We said earlier, sometimes you need to respond, sometimes you don't need to respond. Let me tell you what are perhaps something that I respond to more often than not. And that is whenever I feel like someone is either misrepresenting something I did or something that I've said. Now, my response typically is very much Dragnet-like. It's just the facts and only the facts. Very succinct, and that's how I respond. Listen, that's not what I said. Here is what I said. Boom. Send an email. I don't go on and elaborate about it. I don't want to get involved in this ping pong match of responses. I just simply want to state the facts. Here is what happened, and I sent it. Okay? Now, if someone's just being negative, and they're saying a bunch of stuff, but it's not really calling into question anything that I specifically did or something I specifically said, then a lot of times I just don't respond to that. I let it roll off my back and I move on because I want to stay focused on what I feel my mission is. So we need to be discerning enough to know when to respond and when not to respond. And I can't tell you what your guidelines should be. I shared with you a little bit about mine, but you need to come up with your own parameters, and you need to be discerning enough to know when you respond and when you don't. Finally, I would like to say to you is when criticism comes, keep your eye on the goal. When people are critical of us, we are so tempted to focus on the criticism. And when that happens, we just want to get involved in a skirmish, whether it's because of our pride or our self-esteem has been wounded, but we just want to jump in to the middle of a skirmish. Hey, listen, when criticism comes my way, I get it. I want to jump into the skirmish too because my pride gets hurt perhaps, or my self-esteem is wounded in some way. And you just want to jump in there. But hear me, please hear me. Please know that whenever you exercise restraint, it is going to be well worth it. And as a Christian, one of the things that I want to evaluate my response by is by whether or not it honors Jesus or not. All right? Does it honor him? Does it reflect well of Christ? I'm talking about my response. Does my response reflect well of him? Well, in order for that to take place, there are 4 things quickly, and I mean very quickly, I'd like to share with you that helps me to evaluate how I should respond. Number 1, I want to respond with a listening ear. I want to be attentive. I want to be a person who lets someone else finish their thoughts. I want to be respectful because I understand that how I receive criticism is an opportunity for the character of Christ to shine in my life. Whenever someone sees grace and kindness in me, it allows me to become a witness for Christ to that person who is sharing criticism. And the second thing is, if they're sharing these things with me, and let's say something they're sharing does ring true in my spirit, then it gives me the opportunity to see God work in my life to transform me and to change me and to grow me. So I want to listen well. I want to have a listening ear as I hear what someone has to say. Secondly, I want to respond with humility. I really believe that the best way to respond to criticism is humility. James 4:6 says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So don't let your first response to criticism to be hurling criticism back at that person. I know it's difficult to believe, but perhaps, maybe perhaps, they might actually be saying something that we need to hear. Because I don't know about you, but I have blind spots. You know, I sometimes don't see things properly, and I need other people to speak into my life from time to time. And so I guess what I want to say to you is be humble enough to try to at least give that other person the benefit of the doubt. Don't react quickly. Don't react in anger, but react by asking God to give you discernment to see if there may be a hint of truth in their words. Number 3, respond with gratitude. You know, thank the person for their willingness to be open and honest because it's not always easy to do that. I know it just isn't. And so before you respond with anger, take a moment and say, listen, thank you for sharing with me. You could have talked to a whole lot of other people about this, but you came to me. I appreciate that so much. And ask God to give you a gracious spirit so that you can respond that way. And don't let your first response be to try to tear down a person who you think is trying to hurt you, but evaluate the words, pray over it, and ask God to give you a gracious spirit. Remember what it says in Proverbs 15:31 and 32. It says, the ear that listens to life-giving reproof will dwell among the wise. Whoever ignores instruction despises himself, but he who listens to reproof gains intelligence. And then finally, I would say, respond with prayer. How often do you have someone who says something like this to you whenever they hear that you've been criticized? They'll say, oh, listen, don't worry about that. Just consider the source. My counsel to you is that before you respond to unjust or even just criticism, pray and consider the source, all right? And so I understand that sometimes people are just trying to be critical, but we don't have to let their spirit dictate to us how we respond. We can choose to respond in a way that reflects well of our Christ, of our Savior. So before you just respond negatively to someone who's negative, do your best to follow the great words of the sage Taylor Swift and just shake it off. All right? Do your best to shake it off with prayer. I want to thank you so much for taking some time to share this time with me today. And if there's been something in this video that's resonated with you, let me encourage you to do two things. First of all, like the video down below it. And number two, subscribe to this channel if you would. I hope to share with you week in and week out just some words of encouragement and maybe some things that will help you not only develop personally, but also help you develop spiritually. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week on Living Focused.